Hi everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm Adele Ewan, and I'm a senior resident and board member here at the WIC. And for those of you who know me, you are well aware that I have an endless fascination with different pranks and all things funny. So I'm excited to welcome all of you to our Women Comedy Pinnacle Luncheon featuring Jane Borden. And Jane is an author, arts and entertainment journalist, and comedic performer, which I personally think is a way more chic term than comedian. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Jane Borden.
I like being introduced as she. That's cool. Sorry. No. It made me feel like God's on my side. So I'm very happy to be here, and I got excited thinking that maybe this was like the first Pinnacle Luncheon that had to do with comedy, but then I heard about the I Love Female Orgasms event and how Ricardo got mad because it was Trustees Weekend. And I realized that was definitely a comedy. That's hilarious. So I just want to start out making a couple of quick disclaimers, since I'm not an academic. First of all, I don't believe in generalizations. Nevertheless, I'm about to make a lot of them. I should say that these are not all my ideas, but I'm also not able to cite like the last 14 years of my life. But if I did, it would probably look something like, see back booth of McManus Bar, 2001, 3:30 a.m., credited to that girl who bought the shots. So it's best I don't try. Also, to the extent that these are my ideas, they're nothing more than that. I'm not a sociologist. These are based purely on my own experiences, and my own experiences are being a professional clown. So, grain of salt. And again, I'm also totally right, so I thought I would start by talking about something that happened a couple of years ago, and a few of you may know this, even if you don't follow closely the struggles and careers of women, and probably you're likely to at least caught wind of Toshgate, what I call Toshgate, which is basically the rape joke heard around the world. In July of 2012, during a performance at the Laugh Factory in Hollywood, Daniel Tosh, who's the host of Tosh.0, the wildly successful and ambitiously crass internet clip show on Comedy Central, Tosh made a comment. It wasn't even part of a joke. He just said something about how rape jokes are always hilarious. And then a young woman in the audience shouted back, actually rape jokes are never hilarious. And then Tosh said, wouldn't it be funny if that girl got raped by like 5 guys right now, like right now? The young woman, everyone laughed, and the young woman and her friend left the show. The friend went home and posted about the incident on the internet, and then the internet like broke. So comics, mostly, if not all male, rushed to Tosh's defense, arguing that comics should never be censored, that no topic is off limits, and that this woman, along with feminists everywhere, just can't take a joke. And I have to say, I understand where they're coming from. I also believe that nothing should be off limits in comedy. Satire is one of our only weapons against tyranny that has to be protected, so, no censorship. I also understand where Tosh was coming from when he made the unfortunate joke. The most expeditious way to silence a heckler is with aggression. That's how you usually see it, and there's lots of clips online of guys shutting down hecklers in really alarmingly aggressive ways. And the audience loves it because when someone heckles, it introduces a power imbalance, and the comedian has to have control of the room. If the comedian doesn't have control of the room, the audience feels unease. The audience doesn't want to feel unease. So when the comedian shuts down the heckler, the audience breathes a sigh of relief and cheers. That's how it works. And I also kind of understood the joke itself, which was at heart a very simple illustration of irony. You know, what if exactly what she doesn't want to happen happens? Mixed with heightening, it happens by a bunch, not just one. And also immediacy, you know, like when a sitcom character shouts, "I'm never going to the symphony," cut to them sitting at the symphony, right? Honestly, the mathematics of the joke were superb, and I think that's in part why so many male comics thought it was okay, it was just a joke. The problem, of course, is the joke's content, and not because it's about rape, but because it mocks the victims instead of the oppressors. In other words, the only difference between this and when Michael Richards yelled the N-word at a heckler a few years before is that when Michael Richards did it, no one rushed to his defense. So, why couldn't male comics see it that way? Enter Lindy West, patron saint of female comics, who blogged about the kerfuffle on Jezebel and then was invited to debate her point of view on a show called Totally Biased. Her opponent was Jim Norton, a longtime fan of the rape joke and all manner of shocking and sexually depraved material. Jim's argument was the censorship argument, nothing's off limits. You know, you should be allowed to say whatever you want, and you should be able to take a joke. Lindy's argument was exactly the same rule applies to me. You're allowed to make rape jokes, and I'm allowed to say I don't like them, and you should be able to take criticism. She also argued that there is a culture of rape in America, and that jokes like this, which target the victim instead of the oppressor, feed that culture. Jim countered, as did all of Tasha's supporters at the time, that actually there is not a culture of rape in America, and everyone knew Tasha was just kidding. Now, a lot of intelligent people enjoy Jim Norton's humor, but so do a lot of dirtbags. And after the debate, the dirtbags got vocal and started tweeting at Lindy. The next day, she posted another response titled, "If comedy has no lady problem, why am I getting so many rape threats?" Basically, she wrote about a suffocating deluge of violent misogyny is how American comedy fans react to a woman suggesting that comedy might have a misogyny problem. And I'll just read some of the things that Jim Norton's fans sent to her. "No need for you to worry about rape," I'll go. "I love how the bitch complaining about rape is the exact kind of bitch that would never be raped. Lindy West is a fat cunt who is completely unfuckable. Fat, ugly, angry, no man in her life, this is the conclusion. There is a group of rapists with over 9,000 penises coming for this fat bitch." So, when I read all of this, I grew a little sad, and then I became totally ecstatic. Because this was exactly what we needed. Proof. How do you prove there's a culture of rape? Give a troll a Twitter account. Right? No censorship is the answer, after all. I felt like Lindy was Cary Grant at the end of Singing in the Rain, you know that scene where he like briefly pulls back the curtain and shows who's actually singing the beautiful song. So on cue, basically, intelligent male comics started backpedaling and apologizing and left to Tasha's side, essentially. Tasha himself, of course, apologized. Louis C.K. actually said to Jon Stewart, "I've read some blogs during this whole thing that have made me enlightened to things I didn't know. This one woman said how rape is something that polices women's lives. They have a narrow corridor, they can't go out late, they can't go to certain neighborhoods." Which made me laugh, because it's like, yeah, good job. Well done, Louis C.K. But any path to enlightenment, I guess. And what this did is it just illustrated how deeply seated the ignorance is. That all of these really intelligent, thoughtful comics who do support social change, and if you see Louis C.K. stand up, you can tell he's a good guy. Didn't know, they just didn't know. So what was happening with Lindy West was really nothing short of a revolution in my mind. And I also celebrated these trolls' hateful attacks because this kind of violent reaction could only be one thing: the last desperate throes of the beast who hasn't yet accepted its imminent defeat. It was a death knell. Basically, women were finally making it in comedy. I'm not standing on an aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished or anything, but still. So, how did it happen? First, I want to outline what women in comedy were up against. And these are, as I see it, the forces that kept, and in some cases continue to keep women out of comedy. Some of them are subconscious. The comedian, as I said, must have power. In order to be successful, must control the room. And a woman with this kind of power threatens man in the status quo. B, a comedian is crass, which is unfeminine. I.e., if you're a woman and willing to be crass, then clearly you don't care what men think, and that removes some of their power. C, a comedian traffics in taboos, i.e., if women aren't afraid of taboos, then they don't need to be protected from them by men, which again removes some of their power. And D, good old-fashioned misogyny. I'd like to say, though, I truly believe that excluding a handful of spiteful trolls, most men who participate in the suppression of women in comedy do so unwittingly. Like I said, it's so deep-seated, they don't see it. They can't see the bars of the cage, to use that analogy. But they can be reached, of course, if that's what we've seen. There are also a couple of functional forces at play. Of course, men thwarted change by using the past as a template for the future. Women aren't funny because they haven't been yet, sort of argument. And then B, my personal favorite, which is that a lot of the gatekeepers think with their dicks. In my years, I've seen many men in positions of power in comedy, the show booker, the festival booker, the guy who sold a web series and is hiring actors. They give opportunities to women simply because they want to sleep with them. I've been the beneficiary of this largesse, although I didn't know it at the time. Sometimes women have been able to get ahead this way, but often it backfires because, and I'm sure this is no surprise, the most beautiful woman in the room is usually not also the funniest woman in the room. Sometimes she is, most of the time she's not. So what happens is when that showcase festival or web series happens, guess who's the weakest one in the lineup? The woman. It wasn't her fault, she wasn't ready, she'd been chosen for the wrong reason, but the people in the audience don't know that. They don't know that there are other hilarious, less attractive women who never got a shot. Worse, since she was the only woman involved in the project, she therefore represented all women. And so then the audience says to themselves, see, I knew women weren't funny. And so the exception perpetuated the faulty rule. So women were trapped in a catch-22, right? You have to be powerful in order to win the audience, but in order to win the audience, you can't have power. So how did the first female comics proceed? By saying one thing and doing another, essentially. Taking control while pretending to have none of it. And there are a few ways that they did this, which I'll go through in greater detail with examples. But basically, they either intentionally disguised their femininity or weren't very feminine by happenstance and not design. They did this through self-deprecation, talking themselves down as part of their act, removing power. A lot of the first females comedians were marginalized people, or eventually many women found success by marginalizing themselves on the outskirts of the industry. So in another theory of mine is that in comedy, women's path to power followed the inverse of the racial and socioeconomic hierarchy. It happened from the bottom up. And in the 1920s, the bottom rung of America's ladder was arguably a woman who was also black and a lesbian. And this was Monsey. She was the first female comedian to make a living as a stand-up comic. In the 1920s, she played the Chitlin circuit, which was what was available to black performers during segregation. And on stage, she pretended to be this totally non-threatening grandma character. She made herself big and had a wig. She had dentures, which she pulled out so that her face was sunken in. And then her shtick was that she joked ribaldly about being attracted to younger men. Then she got off stage, slicked back her hair, and put on a suit and traveled the circuit with almost exclusively men. In the 50s, a handful of Jewish women made strides, including Pearl Williams, Belle Barth, and Rusty Warren, who came out of or were influenced by success in the Borscht Belt, which was where all Jewish comedy got its hold in the Catskills. And these women also trafficked in filthy bawdy jokes. Phyllis Diller, also in the 50s, totally desexualized herself. She wore crazy outfits, wigs, and wild makeup. intentionally to make herself unattractive and to hide the shape of her body. She played a caricature of a crazy housewife and did the exact same kind of comedy that was popular at the time, except instead of making fun of wives and mother-in-laws, she made fun of this fictional husband that she'd invented. Lucille Ball, also in the 50s, based her entire career on a female character who can't be trusted to do anything right. But in fact, she was the first woman to head a production company. Joan Rivers, one of the first female stand-ups to hit mainstream, she was given her own talk show opposite Johnny Carson, the first. She mined all of her material by mocking her Jewishness and her bad looks, though in fact she was beautiful. Somehow these tricks worked. Goldie Hawn and Marilyn Monroe couldn't hide the power of their good looks, so they both created a low status by pretending to be idiots. There was a study done in the 70s that found that women used self-deprecating humor 63% of the time, and men only did it 12% of the time. Now, an exception, Marlo Thomas, That Girl, which was a groundbreaking show that aired from 1966 to 1971. It was the first TV show about a working single girl who didn't live with her parents. The character was smart and capable and wasn't from a marginal racial or socioeconomic group. The show was a hit. For the finale, both ABC and the show sponsor Clairol pressured Marlo Thomas to end the finale by having her get together with her love interest and get married, and she refused. And apparently part of the reason she got away with it is she gave an ABC executive a copy of The Feminine Mystique. So the next wave of the late 70s and 80s, Lily Tomlin, Whoopi Goldberg, Roseanne Barr, Paula Poundstone, Ellen DeGeneres, and Boozler, all either gay, masculine, or non-sexualized. Boozler once told the New York Times that once before a TV appearance, she was asked to trade out her opening joke, which was very confident, and instead open with a joke about how she was very ugly. Rita Rudner was also a contemporary of theirs, and Rita was traditionally attractive, so it doesn't surprise me that her stage persona was, as one comic, Karen Kilgariff, calls it, the sexy ditzy mom. Another exception, Meryl Marco. She was a co-creator and head writer of the David Letterman Show, which was totally groundbreaking at the time. It's hard to overstate that, although it's also hard to overstate since Letterman is now a little dated and old. But the show was completely different. It blew out the late night format. So it was very current and groundbreaking, and it was half created by a woman. She and Letterman were dating, and she said she actually put aside her own opportunities to follow his career, which some people have said was shame or whatever, but also he's not going to go be like the co-head writer on a hot and late night talk show. It's an incredible opportunity. But another exception to this exception is that eventually Letterman managed to allow at best or at worst cultivate the most sexist environment in all of late night, which is saying a lot, as late night has not always held open doors to women. Okay, so in the early 90s, the bottom fell out of the stand-up boom in the 80s. And clubs started shutting down all across the country. Many of those that stayed open trafficked in lowest common denominator acts, and almost none of them were booking women. They wouldn't take the risk. A lot of bookers have a rule that there's only one woman per show. This actually still kind of persists. A woman recently posted an email cancellation she got on Twitter that went viral. A booker actually said in an email, sorry, we have to take you off the bill tonight because there's already another woman. So in reaction to this, to all of this, not just the fact that there weren't opportunities for women, but that the stand-up scene was kind of tired and hacked, the alt-comedy scene was born and blossomed, first in LA and later in New York and now all over the country. And that's the circuit that I mostly work. So the reason this was so important is because it was DIY, which meant there were no gatekeepers. There aren't enough spots for women, just create your own. Many of the best shows were produced by women, and female performers flooded the scene. No one in the traditional power structure cared because these shows were totally off the radar, and so they were given an opportunity to really develop their voices. Janine Garofalo, Margaret Cho, Laura Keitner, and of course Sarah Silverman. Sarah absolutely exploded everything because she's vulgar and she's hot. And that was really kind of fun, at least at her level. like a brain explosion. Also, she utilized zero self-deprecation. She's totally confident, and she displayed zero tenderness or regret, which were other stereotypically feminine attributes of comedy. Also, she wasn't personal. So she was sort of this anti-female comic, while at the same time being like the most feminine-looking comic, according to the male gaze that had come up. So we're currently in part 2 of the DIY movement, wherein women continue to find opportunities in the margins on the internet, on cable TV instead of network, in storytelling shows as opposed to stand-up, writing memoirs instead of Letterman's monologue jokes. I don't know if most memoir is trafficked by women and purchased by women. I don't know if that's because memoir is inherently a feminine form, or if that's just because women read. I mean, that's why the publishing industry produces so many of them, because they say women read and men consume television, and that's why it's harder for women to get into television. So women just said, oh, okay, well, I'll just write a book then. And that's totally exploded in the last 10 years as well. Meanwhile, taking advantage of the gains that women had made up to this point was a new breed of pioneer. The ones who kept their heads down, did the work, played by the rules within the system, and finally did rise up through mainstream traditional outlets. This is, of course, how Tina Fey became a gatekeeper to one of the most powerful comedic outlets in the world. And then, of course, SNL booked the most banging female cast of all time. Amy Poehler, Maya Rudolph, Rachel Dratch, Kristen Wiig. But it didn't just happen because of Tina. It happened because this was the moment of critical mass. One, there were more female cultural icons to be mocked than ever before. I mean, the sketch that really made Tina and Amy household names was the Sarah Palin Hillary Clinton sketch. Two, enough generations had passed for male audiences to be totally accustomed to laughing at women. They did nothing. Three, there was a whole generation of female voices who literally trained to be comics and were ready to fill in any open slot. And most important, four, women were now an undeniable market. And that is thanks to Sex and the City. I don't care how much you feel that the show pushed back feminism by suggesting ad nauseum that women do nothing but talk about women buying shoes. It still did more for women in comedy than anything else during the decade it was on the air. I know it was only on the air for 6 years, but it really felt like a decade. Because it proved that there's a huge market out there who will not only consume female-driven comedy, but also consume the product being sold by the sponsors thereof. So, powder keg, explosion, blowback. The first blowback started with Christopher Hitchens. Do y'all remember the article he published in 2007 in Vanity Fair, which makes me lose a lot of respect for Vanity Fair. It was titled "Why Women Aren't Funny," and it was like the Trolls with the Tosh blowback. It served to just disprove itself. It was the most ridiculous thing. Read it as a piece of comedy. It's hilarious. Christopher Hitchens, who I don't think has been outside of like a wealthy Manhattan apartment in 50 years, just proved himself to be totally out of touch. His arguments were basically that women weren't funny because they didn't have to be in order to attract men, while men did have to be funny in order to attract women. And I'm worried about me not being a sociologist. He also argued that the reason men were funny is because it was like a release for them. They had to get away from women and crack jokes at each other to like put a salve on their wounds of dealing with the fact that women could have children, and that we were so much more powerful than men. Well, at least, I think you're fat or whatever. But he may have said it in a really stupid way, but he wasn't alone. For about 2 years, you probably remember, every media outlet took turns asking the question, are women funny? But by then the question was a non-starter, it was undeniable. Mom Jeans is one of the funniest sketches that's ever been written. Also along the way there have been enough exceptions to the very gross generalizations I had made for haters to be unable to write off female success as an effect of any one cultural trend, and not just an inherent ability. And anyway, meanwhile, there were now suddenly very mainstream women in very mainstream outlets talking about very stereotypically feminine subjects. Chelsea Handler, Whitney Cummings, Amy Schumer. They're white, they're beautiful, they use no self-deprecation and make no apologies, and they're personal. They talk about themselves, they talk about dating and buying shoes, and people love it. It's girly, finally. Women have filled in every space of the margin until we had a piece of paper surrounded. And that's when we heard the death knell, in my opinion, Toshgate. And it wasn't just that incident either. If you were pointing the comedy at the time, there were rape jokes all over the place for like 6 months. I don't know if more were being told or if it's just that more were being reported, but suddenly any kind of misogyny was getting called out on blogs and on Twitter. Feminist bloggers became like the enemy of male comics, according to male comics. It's not like they were getting together and being like, I mean, it got so relentless that guy comics started just being like, oh my god, lay off! and the bloggers were like, no? And part of what made me so happy about seeing this happen was that lady comics needed these feminist bloggers to do some of the dirty work. And what I mean when I say that is that as a comedian, instead of making the message more important than your comedy, you're not first and foremost a comedian. People talk about, there are a lot of like political comedians, and they get ghettoized a little bit. People don't consider them to be as funny. If you were really funny, why would you only talk about politics? That's sort of the feeling that people have. This is the reason why Jon Stewart never says, you know, like, oh, we have a message, or we're trying to make change, or we have a progressive outlook. He never says that. All he ever says is we're clowns, we make jokes, that's all we do, and that's in part an insurance. So, it's harder for a female comedian to rant, criticize, beg, and fight. And so, being able to work together with this other voice in the industry was really helpful. Basically, the way female comedians counter this kind of attack is just by proving that they're funny. Oh, women aren't funny? Okay, well, I'm going to make you laugh, so obviously you're wrong. And I'd just like to read one of my favorite examples of this, which is from Tina Fey. A guy posted on Delisted, Tina Fey is an ugly, pear-shaped, bitchy, overrated troll. And Tina Fey responded in an open letter. His name was Centaurus, the guy. And she says, Tina Fey is an ugly, pear-shaped, bitchy, overrated troll. Dear Centaurus, first let me say how inspiring it is that you have learned to use a computer. I hate for our correspondence to be confrontational, but you have offended me deeply. To say I'm an overrated troll when you have never even seen me guard a bridge is patently unfair. I'll leave it for others to say if I'm the best, but I am certainly one of the most dedicated trolls guarding bridges today. I always ask 3 questions, at least 2 of which are riddles. As for ugly, pear-shaped, and bitchy, I prefer the terms offbeat, business class ass, and exhausted. But I'll take what I can get. There's no such thing as bad press. Now go to bed, you crazy night owl. You have to be at NASA early in the morning so they can look for your penis with the Hubble telescope. There's another, I don't want to butcher this joke, but she replies to a few, she's replied to a few of these articles over time, and there was one where part of the guy's criticism said that she didn't have a funny bone in her body, and at the end of her response to him, she said, I don't have a funny bone in my body, I had your mom's last night. Where are we headed next? Obviously, it's not over. Last year, Saturday Night Live had no black female cast members or writers and hadn't in years. But as unforgivable as that was, when people complained about it, Saturday Night Live said, okay, we'll hire one. Which to me says that we've come a really long way. And we still have a long way to go, but we're headed in the right direction. There's no way to know what the future of female comedy will look like, because now that the gates are open, we don't have to worry about whether our humor is too much or too little feminine. It can just be, which means that we have a whole lot of diversity ahead of us. In other words, the distinctions are collapsing. And I felt this shift within myself. I very much came up in the mindset of believing that I'm a comic who happens to be a woman, not a woman comic. I didn't want to be pigeonholed. I also hated showing up at a party and having someone walk up to me and be like, so how do you feel about being a woman in comedy? It was just annoying, constantly talking about it and thinking about it. I didn't want to fight, I didn't want to bitch, I just wanted to do the work, you know? If anything, I steered away from quote-unquote feminine humor. That's partly because I don't personally do a lot of the stereotypically feminine comedy material about dating, relationships, love. When my book was published, it was really important to me that I not be pigeonholed as a chick lit writer, because no men read chick lit writers, only women read chick lit writers, and I wanted to be considered someone who wrote for everyone. And when Bust reviewed my book and mentioned that they liked the fact that there was no sex in it, I considered this a major achievement. And when a friend at NPR refused to read it because he thought it was for girls, I was furious. It's not for girls, I thought. I'm not girly, I thought. And by extension, I thought, because girly is not good. I fell for the trap. I bought into the distinction. I used to be like, I don't do period jokes. Because talking about your period was the worst thing you could do as a female comic. It was a career suicide. I've had bookers ask me oh, okay, yeah, you seem funny. You don't do period jokes, right? It's a thing. Meanwhile, all male comics do is talk about their ejaculate. 50% of their act. Chelsea Peretti made a joke once that if men bled out of their dicks, they'd never shut up about it. The truth, of course, is that I am girly. I have a vagina. I'm just a different kind of girly than whatever the stereotype is, but what the hell does the most common stereotype mean anyway? I am the kind of girly who just doesn't do material about dating and sex, nothing more, nothing less. By the way, I like jokes about dating and sex, I just don't do them myself. That doesn't make me or my comedy any less feminine. Is there a feminine voice? There are as many as there are female women. When faced finally with such diversity, we have the comfort and freedom to stop trying to figure out what the feminine voice is, much less if we have too much or too little of it, and just sort of open our mouths and let whatever happens come out. Trying to define feminine humor is a process which inherently dwarfs, alters, or redefines what your specific humor is. Today, women, like I said, can just open their mouths. Whatever comes out is feminine. So just like I said, no censorship. That's it. Thanks, guys. So does anybody have any questions?
As a woman who are interested in getting into comedy, do you have any advice for people our age?
Yeah.
I keep thinking about starting a blog, but then I'm everyone has a blog.
You should totally start a blog. Especially if you want to write. What you want to write is jokes, then I would suggest Twitter. But yeah, even if it's not getting you attention, it's giving you an opportunity to develop your voice. One of the most important things in comedy is being ready when opportunity happens, and so don't put off figuring out what your voice is. I would also suggest taking a class at an improv or sketch theater. You can't really learn stand-up in a class, you just do it. But when you're first getting started out, it's nice to have a community, and so the improv and sketch theaters really provide that. Also, you learn, that's community skill. Also, probably the most fun thing ever. One good thing about having a community is, 10 years later, a lot of you will be selling shows or doing tours, and those things get fed by your community, so everyone helps each other. And that's also a big reason why women have made so many strides recently, is that the more women get in positions of power, the more they can pull other women up. I don't have a problem with that. So yeah, I would suggest moving to Chicago, New York, LA, San Francisco, a good place to start, and just doing it.
Do you think there's a difference between like funny people and like funny comedians? Like I know lots of people are funny, but what's the difference? Is it just that funny comedians like on stage or on a platform? And
Yeah, I mean, that and a lot of it is craft. A funny person has a funny idea, a comedian works tirelessly at it. Stand-ups do their 5 minutes of material 200 times to perfect it. But a lot of it is also just attitude. I mean, I'm sure you've seen comics that you don't think are that funny, who in the audience is like going crazy. So a lot of it is just having the nerve and being confident enough to control the audience. It's really half of it, and then the other half is material, in my opinion. Improv was an interesting illustration of this for me, because in improv you do have a lot of people who are doing comedy as a hobby. They have day jobs, and they're so much funnier than you, and it kills you. I think because improv is a little more casual, and you don't necessarily have to give your life over to it like a touring stand-up would, you see a lot of people like the funny guys at the office in improv, and some of them eventually pursue comedy, and some of them don't. But yeah, I mean, I think the distinction is just, like you said, choosing to be on stage.
Regarding David Letterman's retirement, what do you think the actual chances are of CBS hiring a woman? I guess I read that someone put that there are more white men named Jimmy on late night than there are women.
That's a great distillation of the issue. I flip. I go back and forth. The cynical side of me that has seen the last 30 years says that there's a chance they'll give it to a woman. But if there were ever a time, it would be now. I mean, Chelsea Chandler has certainly proved that. I've heard that she might be being considered. I don't know, that would certainly change her perspective. I don't think you can have a dress up a little person in chaps on the 11:30 CBS late night show. But yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be great for a person of color, or someone gay? I mean, it would all be incredible. I don't know, it would be a big risk for CBS. And CBS is doing really well right now, so they don't have to take big risks. So we'll see.
Do you have a favorite comedian?
Sure, it's always changing, but Tina Fey, Amy Poehler for sure, of course. I also really love Mike Birbiglia. Louis C.K., of course, although I'm just a little bit gotten over it. But he's incredible. I've just been a fan for a long time. Let's see. There's a guy named Bill Burr, who's great. And that's a great example of how far attitude and stage presence can take you. Bill Burr is also very funny. He has great material. He loves to push buttons. He's that guy that wants to like he tells a joke about Rihanna. I mean, he probably doesn't tell it anymore, but when Chris Brown beat her, that you think in the beginning is like, oh my God, he's making fun of, domestic violence. And he's not, but that's sort of his shtick, is that he likes to shake you up and then bring you back. And a great example of that, if you want to go home and Google it, is he did a show in Philadelphia in a stadium. and they turned on him immediately. And he just started shouting like a bunch of like very basic insults about Philadelphia, like he's insulting their sports team, insulting the Philly cheesesteak. So dumb, and they were like, and he really, like, then if they were booing before, then he really had their hatred, and then he was like, 15 more minutes, you got 15 more minutes of this, and then he just kept going and shouting, he's not going down, and then you slowly see the chef, and the audience starts laughing, and then he's just like 12 more minutes, 9 more minutes, and then at the end they are just on their feet. It's incredible. Yeah, there's a lot of great young comics too. Eliza Skinner is really wonderful. I don't know if y'all know her, you should look her up. She's an example of a female comedian who has done a good job of walking the line of having a message and still being first and foremost considered a comedian. She posted a really funny tweet. Oh God, I'm not gonna remember it, but she was like 1960 something, Gloria Steinem says blank, some, seminal quote about the feminist movement, and she says, 2013, Eliza Skinner says, "Oh, you're out of cake pops? Cake pops, or are you Starbucks?" She also posted when the movie Her came out and was getting so much acclaim, she posted that. She's really big on Twitter. She posted, "A man falls in love with his operating system, and it's considered tender, beautiful, and groundbreaking. A woman falls in love with her cats, and she's crazy."
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is, when did you know you were funny? And
I'm funny?
and the second one is, would you do a short bit for us?
Oh. I don't think I'm unfunny, but I also think that part of the reason I went into comedy is because I wanted to be. I was driven to do that. People talk about, like, you probably hear comics say a lot, like, I just love making people laugh. And that's interpreted as them being fake or pandering or whatever. But that is true. I think people are just misunderstanding it. I love the power of making people laugh. I'm not doing anyone a favor, it's for me. I will tell you a story. Before, many of you know my husband, Dr. Stockdale. Before we got married, we had to go see a marriage counselor, like the church made us do that. Because a 65-year-old evangelical Christian was like really in tune with our relationship. He made us take this compatibility test, and we actually paired up in almost every category. For example, in personal finances, we each scored a 10 out of 100. And in self-confidence, we each scored a 90. So basically, when it comes to money, we have no idea what we're doing, but we're pretty sure we know
So I know you've done a lot of comic writing and also done a lot of stand-up. Which do you prefer, or like which is easier to make your voice really come through?
They complement one another so well. The immediacy of stand-up is really addictive, and there's a lot of freedom in stand-up. I've written a book. It's not only available to literally anyone, but it will be there forever. Until I forgot any of those but tomorrow. So there are a lot of things that I shy away from in the book, shy away from talking about. And in stand-up, it's because I'm a lot bawdier in stand-up, a lot more risque, I guess. But Stand-up is to a certain degree a little false. You have to create a barrier with the audience, and also you have to heighten the jokes to the point that they're not. The joke I just told you is 100% true, but they aren't always, you know what I mean? And memoir is, so that feels to a certain degree like a more true to celebrity